Okay,
Oh,
now I'm actually recording. I just turned that off because we didn't need to have that.
I'm very sorry. I thought I pressed mute.
That'll happen. I thought I hit record last time and I just didn't. But now I can see the little record thing up. So we're starting to talk about diversifying data. And I was talking to Brooke about this idea I had to look on a website called Chalkbeat. Chalkbeat covers the teacher beat from the teacher perspective in a journalistic way. Because she's doing mindfulness and yoga, she could go to Chalkbeat and look up nationally news on school policies, on school programs, on people doing yoga or mindfulness in whatever way. But she could also use Chalkbeat. And the reason I'm going into these details is because this is a model for how to do research. And she could go to a hyper specific area, like, say, New York or Denver. And if you're in Denver, and say, Brooke, do you live in Denver? Does anybody live in Colorado?
No.
No. Okay. Brooke, where do you live?
Columbus, Ohio.
Columbus, actually, Columbus, Ohio has I have some connections to Columbus. I have connections to Columbus Public Schools, in fact. So more that's really cool that you told me that. All right, that's really interesting. Anyway, so she puts in Columbus, Ohio, and she can put in mindfulness or yoga or whatever keyword she figures out. And then she'll get descriptions of journalists describing new programs that use yoga or mindfulness. She can get interviews with people doing this. She can get interviews with school leaders doing policies. And from there, she can figure out what schools are using mindfulness and yoga. Going further, she can craft a letter of solicitation, send it to the school, and ask to interview the principal, the assistant principal head of instruction, and one or two teachers using this program. Once you find some findings on there, again, I know a little bit about schools, she could take it a step further, look at what she's found, and then take what she found to generate questions and call the district and contact the school district and see if, and she could turn into a critical journalist here, which is always a good thing, and see if it works out. Maybe call bullshit or maybe call awesome. Who knows? But based on that, just using these couple resources, you'd be generating your own primary sources. You're getting your own data. And it's always important to get data that's not in a book. Now, one of my favorite scholars who will be speaking to us a little bit later was William Chavez, and he talks about diversifying data. Now, he describes a class that he and I both took by David Gordon White, and the syllabus is called for the class is called Worship Without Devotion. And in that, our project required us to use, I believe, 4 out of 10 non-textual or non-usual textual sources to make our argument about the history of divinity in India. These included non-Sanskrit texts, non-Indic texts, like, say, Greek writing, or, say, French writing or Italian writing, or even, for that matter, like gazetteers, British colonial writing. Then we could also look at numismatics, study of coins, art history, always an important thing. And from art history, not just sculpture, but temple architecture. I mean, other things that you use, non-Puranic Hinduism. With Hinduism, the majority of all the stories we know are from the Puranas, then maybe the Mahabharata. But getting out of those and reading wider, different things like the Katha which is an epic tale about Kashmir, which does overlap with the time of Abhinava, and you have living tantrikas in there. So moving away from the standard text, diversifying your data. And if you were to be talking to William, he would then explain how he is a scholar of exorcism, in fact, but he uses cinema and he uses all sorts of, he uses cinema, he uses folk tales, he uses ethnography. He traveled all over the Midwest and stayed with my parents at one point, interviewing exorcists, mostly of the Protestant persuasions. And he also discovered that quite a few of them were also into cryptozoology. Intriguing. There is a certain interpretive drift when you get into the occult world where if you like aliens, you might get into ghosts, you might get into Bigfoots. interpretive drift. Okay, so today, our agenda involves what we have on the website. So let me quick share my screen. We had for our reading today, I got the reading out to you way too late because I'm a big jerk. And I'm sorry about that. But did you get a chance to read the 60 pages of Umberto Eco? A little bit? You just needed to get an overall vibe for it.
I skimmed it. Yeah.
It's a classic. It's actually worth reading in detail at some point and following all of the machinations of the way he narrows theses and narrows research methodologies and whatnot. It's dated though, because we don't live in a time with card catalogs anymore. But the thing I found from teaching this section is it impresses upon students the rigor of research and the importance of taking notes and the importance of finding your own clear system to take notes and make sense of things, which is why we're reading it as we're beginning to work on our annotated bibliographies. Okay, so what do I have to talk about today? Just a few things, then we're going to share our annotated bibliographies. And but before that, let's just do a quick check-in. Where are you at in your research work and in your polishing your 6 pages from before? Because remember, you have six pages due to me soonish. One at a time, either or, all at once.
My 6 pages are coming along. I'm
Good.
much happier with the progress this time. I hope you will at least be a little bit happier with it as well. I feel like I'm starting to find more of a focus and what I'm arguing about.
Good.
So I think that, yeah, right.
Good.
My translation project with Ben is helping tremendously because we're looking at the Samkhya Karka and the Samkhya Saptati Fritti, and it's giving me my information and helping me kind of focus in on what's going on. So
yeah, so there again, you're generating your own primary data. So
cool.
for
That's good to know.
instance, when Eco is talking about, you have primary and critical sources. So a critical source is, say, a book about Abhinavagupta. A primary source would be the writings of Abhinavagupta. To study Abhinavagupta, you generally can't just start reading. You have to learn Sanskrit. So Eco would recommend that you read the critical literature, the books about Abhinavagupta, but not all of it. Read enough that you understand the major arguments to interpret, then go back to Abhinava and read him carefully and try to understand him on his own. Thinking about those critical ideas, but try to understand him just on what is his own. However, as you're doing that, Abhinava is a little bit of a problem because he has all those quotes. And he has quotes in his auto commentaries and the Jayadratha Yamala and whatnot. So you do need to some degree to figure out what is the context of Abhinava to figure out if those texts are available or not. And if you're going to be reading a passage of Abhinava, your ass has to at least try to figure out where those quotes are, to find those quotes or at least figure out how the texts are related or how he knew them. So that's part of the context of the primary text. So after you've read your passages, then at that point, that's when you go and you read everything. You read absolutely everything on the topic. And that's the difference between a thesis and any other type of writing. And that's what academic writing is. You have to have the full bibliography that shows you are at least aware of every aspect of this problem. If you don't have that, then someone reads your book. Sometimes they don't even read it. They just look at the bibliography and go, didn't cite that book. This book isn't worth reading. So you have to head them off the path and have it complete. And I'll tell you a little secret. You don't have to read everything in your works cited or your bibliography. You don't have to read everything, but you got to make reference to everything that's important. And you have to know somewhat the contents of everything on there. So you have to be able to at least be like, well, these are important for these reasons. But students often get overwhelmed by trying to read too much before writing. So I like this methodology of you find a topic you're interested in, you read some of the critical literature and then stop. And then you look at your primary stuff. and then you go back and read wider critical literature and that's where you're really refining your thesis, where you come in to that conversation. So what you're doing with Ben is you're generating the primary material. The other thing that's an advantage of working with Ben that Echo talks about is at some point, you show stuff to your advisor. So Ben is a great person for that because you can say, you can show him your bibliography that you'll be generating as you go along and say, what else needs to be here? And he'll say these 5 things, which is also like talking to a librarian, which is an important thing to do.
He is a librarian.
Hmm?
He is kind of like a librarian.
So one other thing that I thought about as I was looking at Echo this morning was that Naropa does not have a great library. That's fine. It's got a great library for what it's worth. But if you are in Boulder, you can go and use the library at CU Boulder. How so? And you can do this regardless because you're Naropa students. University of Colorado is a public university, which means their libraries, which all university libraries have research librarians. Those research librarians at a private or at a public university are beholden not just to the researchers, but to the community. Because you are members of the Naropa community, you could contact the CU Boulder research librarians in South Asia or school policy or whatever you're doing and have a chat with them. My experience is even at a private university, these people are thrilled to talk to you. And what you'll find when I work with research librarians is they know digital resources that I've never heard of. And then they also have a good knowledge of these. They aren't as big of a deal anymore, but reference things like published annotated bibliographies or published bibliographies on topics that are published and bound that you used to find in reference sections, but now they're all sort of digitized. So these people will know a wider range of search capabilities. They'll also be able to find access to a lot of these things. And usually these days, unless it's a whole book, they can get you a scan pretty easy. A lot easier than you requesting through interlibrary loan sometimes. Now, I assume Naropa has a decent interlibrary loan program. Does anyone know? Yes, okay, good. So use that as much as possible, but of course, you don't live there, so you're going to be sort of limited to the to getting digital and digitized sources. That brings me to another question. This is very much on Echo to the both of you to today. What is your research library you're using?
Mine's Naropa. I've been using JSTOR and looking at like their discovery catalog. Pretty much.
But where are you going to get books? If you need a book, where are you going to get a book? Amazon. Well, if it's not in print?
It's not in print?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's not in print.
That's a very good point. WorldCat?
WorldCat will tell you where to find it.
Okay.
So you're in Chicago.
Yeah.
Your best bet would be to contact the Chicago Public Library, which will have interlibrary loan and will be able to borrow from a wide range of university libraries. If there's a public university near you, you can contact them and ask about getting research privileges. Simply say that you were doing a master's degree at Naropa University and you are a community member, and then pursue that. Don't get discouraged. Somebody will eventually say yes and give you access. That's happened to me many times. I've also gotten discouraged and given up. That was bad on me. Brooke, do you have a research university library in Columbus? Maybe.
Well, now after hearing your conversation, I'm thinking maybe I could go to OSU.
You mean the Ohio State University? They do have quite a nice library, and it's public, so you shouldn't have too much trouble there. And just kind of impress upon them, you are a community member, you're doing a master's degree, and you'd like library privileges. And you can even say to them, I have electronic privileges or digital privileges through my university, Naropa, but I need access to physical books and physical resources. So that's a little trick that everybody should do. And it's important. It's important to have access to some stuff that you just, everything is getting more and more digitized, but there will be stuff. There will be stuff you'll need. Okay, so Brooke, where you at?
I am very much still in the preliminary phase. And it's funny you should talk about like limiting research at first before you start writing. So I kind of got to that on my own
Good.
because I was feeling very overwhelmed. In a good way, I was feeling like just deeply inspired by everything I was reading. And so
I love that feeling.
yeah, but it was just it was like, okay, this could be a lot. And so I wanted to narrow some things down. So one of the things I like to do is like excerpt quotes and passages in an article that speak to me and then respond to them. So I'll like write them out and
Now,
then
remember what we talked about last week, though. Are
right,
you,
but I'm okay, sorry.
you making it very clear what is quoted and what are Brooke's own languages?
Oh yeah. I've been working on that, fleshing it out. Also with the 6 pages, so I realized you asked for a lot of definitions, a lot of, I was like, clarity is the word here. And so, and then I also realized that that's definite to provide that's definitely going to be more than 6 pages, I feel.
That's okay, right? Make choices. You know,
Yeah.
write 10 pages and then just give me 6 of them. I don't care. It's fine.
Yeah. So yeah, so then that's that. As far as the topic itself,
Yeah.
it's kind of evolving, and I wonder what you think of this lens. Because I'm reading and I'm on academic, EDU and all that other stuff, and just academia, and just kind of reading through everything. And I do feel like there is a healthy amount of conversation around mindfulness in the West and mindfulness in the East. Like I feel like that is like something that's buzzing right now. So I was thinking like, okay, how can I get just a bit more specific and maybe creative with the lens? And so was it last semester? Maybe no, it was the semester before. I was with Ben and I did my research paper on Adhikara. And so it's like the student and the paper was about like, who are the tantric students? Sorry.
What was the topic? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the word you said.
Oh, the topic was about Adhikara, and maybe I'm saying it wrong.
Yeah.
So it's like, who are the students? And it was kind of this like evolution of who were yogic practitioners, and what drew them to this path. And so into motivation. And so what I was thinking about as I was reading is that might be an interesting question to ask now, right? And so I was looking at like all of the data I had that was like kind of harkening back to like this education, the students, right? Like the students in inner city schools or, in urbanized schools, the students in Hollywood or, the guru mamas, not that I have to write about all of them, but just kind of, I was interested in kind of maybe continuing on that topic. And maybe instead of just talking about mindfulness in the East and West, maybe bringing it in and focusing on a lens of who are the students, who were the students, in classical yoga and mindfulness, and who are the students now. And then, maybe like talk about some motivations. Like I thought there was a really interesting research paper that I read last night, and it was very interesting. And they were talking about how apps like Calm and Headspace has changed mindfulness and has evolved mindfulness essentially and who participates. And so while there's a lot of research and papers on like the medicalization of mindfulness, there hasn't been really much attention to apps and kind of flushing out that because they're two
the teching.
because they're two separate things. and they draw on two different audiences. And so I think we touched on this a little bit. I touched on it a little bit on my paper, and then you and I touched on it. And just this idea of like training the workers, right? Making better workers, people who are
I
calm
inherently
and happy.
distrust anything Elon Musk says about the mind and mindfulness, because I know the way that freak's thinking.
Exactly, right? And so I thought maybe, because the conspiracy theorist in me gets really happy about that. So, and so does the Marxist. So I was thinking that might be an interesting lens as well.
Yeah.
So I would have to flush it out a little.
There that's interesting is it's a reflection of the neoliberal thing. I think that that's really neoliberal economic systems. That's the big thing. The problem I see in your is actually at the beginning of the argument, where you're like, what's the difference between a student in the East and a student in the West? Well, one, what's East and West? But then the other thing that you said to me is mindfulness in the East and mindfulness in the West. I'm hard pressed to find a term that is equivalent of mindfulness in Sanskrit literature. So of course you proceed and say, well, it's not there. But first you'd have to flesh out exactly what is this mindfulness thing, which is an interesting project. And then if you can find an analog, great. But then what I think you would have to do is look through the Sanskrit literary sources and the philosophical sources and posit things that are somewhat similar, and then argue that these are similar, they're not the same. But then you have to figure out if this like neoliberal 21st century mindfulness that says it's drawing on ancient tradition, is it drawing on ancient tradition or is it drawing on something else? What's it really drawing on? Because it's going to say it's from India. Why? Because that makes it authentic. Does it have to be from India to say it's from India? No. Have you seen a Tibetan singing bowl? Those things didn't exist 60 years ago. So authenticity and tradition are tricky on that. As I really like that, and this is just me riffing a little bit on it, Brooke, but I was in therapy a little while back. I'm always in therapy. Therapy's good. And so I don't need to feel things on my own. I'm not to be trusted. And my therapist said, have you thought about trying meditation? And I tried to not laugh out loud. I'm like, you can know a little bit about it. It's not really, well, maybe you could try an app for meditating or go on one of those guided meditations. I'm like, wow, your notion of meditation and mine are very different. But then that's a shift in language. So, Brooke, there's so much to do there. You also would probably need to track out when trying to figure out what is mindfulness. You'd have to kind of like look through, and I don't know the right search term, but this would work. Just like look up usage of the term mindfulness just generally in journalism, maybe even in the last 10 years. And I'm talking to a research librarian would be really helpful on that. Like you could do a LexisNexis search or something like that, like a big journalistic database, and just type in mindfulness and just get 1,000 articles. And then you don't have to read 1,000 articles, but you read as many as you can to find a kind of sketch out themes, to see what do people mean when they say mindfulness? Because I don't know what they actually mean. I'm not sure they know what they actually mean. And of course, you've heard my complaint about this mindfulness in schools business. If you go far enough back, you will also find Goldie Hawn, and Goldie Hawn is a Tibetan Buddhist. So there's the tendrils of Tibetan Buddhism. Like they're horrible tendrils and all, but they're there and they are religious. So there's a lot of aspects there. That moves away from like the school policy thing, which is fine. You got to figure out where you want to be. But the thing I'm most concerned about, though, is that beginning part, is that mindfulness in the East, mindfulness in the West.
Well, it's not so much East. I mean, I threw that term around, but specifically classical.
Okay.
Classical yoga, yeah, specifically.
So you mean specifically classical yoga, our Sankhya, our Yoga Sutras?
Yeah, exactly.
Already that's a lot clearer. Okay. So, and You said you started this by saying you're asking for a lot of definitions. Yeah, that's how academic writing works. But the cool thing is you get to define things. It's what Brooke says. So I say, what the heck does this word mean? And then you tell me, and I go, okay, now write that down. And then the other trick that we get screwed on is we believe that we need to use different words for the same things to vary our language. We got taught this in middle school. It's absolutely false. People understand more clearly when you use the same words meaning the same thing every time. We get worried like, I'm sounding repetitive. You're like, no, you're sounding clear. Clear is good. So always be resistant of novelty in terms, especially if like, this is a good way to phrase it. If you're like, that's a really good way to phrase it, then you got to stop and think, okay, so that has to go first, and we're going to phrase it that way every time. You're always proposing your own terminologies and your own taxonomies. You set them out at the beginning and you just continue to use them. That way, when you get to the end and you write, the hermeneutic of displaced selves establishes that the mind is only a mirror, and you read that and I go, oh, hermeneutic, displaced self, mind, mirror. I can read that sentence. If I hadn't read the beginning, I couldn't. So that's your goal. And then because you have a wonderfully playful sense of word choice, got to be careful in academic writing to be really specific. However, because you have that, which is a superpower, however, because you have that really good sense of, I don't know if it's rhythm or something, but I noticed it in your writing. You have a good way of like, you're working through, and then you'll land on a really good one. So keep doing that. But when you land on that really good one, then you go, that's the one. You pull that out and you put it right at the beginning. So generate and explore. And when you find yourself riffing and you find a really good idea or a good phrase in there, you don't have to throw that away. Just throw out all the stuff before it and keep that one. Writer's tricks.
Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I said it'll be interesting.
Well, I mean, this is how I write, and we're going to talk about more about this next week. We're going to do the automatic writing and the history of occult writing and tarot. The students really dig it, but I'll be getting into this thing where we think that Aaron Michael Ulrey writes a thing. Aaron Michael Ulrey, he puts some words together now and then, but I know when I'm writing, these ideas just come out of nowhere that I never could have sat down going A to B to C to D to E. You know, I'll be going A to B to C, and then I'll be over at F and go, oh shit, I got to start with F. And then, oh, G, and then A, and then C. And the thing that happens there is your unconscious mind, or as I call it, your big brain. Let the big brain do the work. When those ideas come out, the big brain is working. Not this little idiotic ahankara, but the one that's the big expansive thing where the really big ideas come from. And the only way to get the big brain working is to access it. And that's usually just through writing a lot and seeing what happens. All right, so for our little conversation today, I want to ramble just a quick minute here. Let me get my thing up, and then we'll share a little bit about our annotated bibliographies, and then we will be done for the day. It's an easy day today. All right. Why does it keep telling me that my screen sharing is paused? This new monitor is killing me. Why is my screen sharing paused? All right, it just doesn't like that one. Fine. All right. It's my other class. It's not work either. Okay, I will just look at my thing up here. This is much easier. This is the easier thing to do. Where are you? You come here. You come here. All right. So as Echo sort of sets out, we talked about primary and secondary sources and direct and indirect sources. So when you are writing a thesis, it's important to figure out where you're going to get your information. Your information, for the most part, needs to be a primary source. A primary source is an original text. So if I was writing about Abhinavagupta, the primary source would be the Tantraloka. The secondary source would be Alexis Sanderson. When at all possible, you should get your quotes from primary sources, not secondary sources. And you should not confuse reading secondary sources from primary sources. So when you're reading Sanderson, despite him being the greatest living Tantrika scholar of all time, you're not reading Abhinava. You're reading a critical literature, a secondary literature. You're reading somebody writing about someone. So when you are trying to build an argument, you go to the primary source, and then you see what Sanderson has to say. And if you agree with him, you quote him. Or if you don't agree with him, you quote him and you disagree with him. The point is, you're making your argument from the primary source because everything you're doing is creating a brand new argument. Many Naropa students, I find, get stuck in the idea of just summarizing everything that has been said about Abhinavagupta and then saying, I agree with this. And then you go, yeah, well, you haven't proven anything. You just listed all the critical arguments and then said that you agree with something, as opposed to, say, finding the passage from Abhinava, listing all the critical sources, and then saying, this is the correct argument. I follow Ditchkowski on this. And then you say why, and then you go back and you give quotes from the primary source to support that argument. You're always building outward from the primary source with reference to the critical source. The primary source is the big topic. The critical literature about that is the overall general conversation in the academy about it. But here's the cool thing. You're a part of that conversation. So at the end of your writing, you are contributing to that. So see yourself as being as being part of that critical conversation, as writing your own critical literature. But we're always trying to get back to a primary source. So if I was writing about Edgar Allan Poe, my primary source would be Edgar Allan Poe. Then I would look at readings of Poe from literary theorists like Harold Bloom or Stanley Fish. But I would always be looking to make my own argument. Your argument isn't the summary of Harold Bloom and Stanley Fish. Your argument is your argument, and you're showing how you fit in to that conversation. Now, with Sanskrit literature, there are dilemmas. We will quote out of secondary sources. Like I will quote a passage that Alexis Sanderson translates. If possible, I always go back to the original and give my own translation. You can't always do that. So if you do that, you quote someone else's translation and you clearly say translated by, and you make it clear that that's what it comes out of. But whenever possible, you should get your own direct, very close reading itself of the most primary source as possible. There was an interesting point in Echo where he starts talking about he wants to, if he was a student, he wanted to write about some aspect of Japanese philosophy. Well, he doesn't know Japanese, so that's a problem. But he starts reading widely, and he reads about a lot of these Americans in the Beat generation, you know, your Kerouacs, your Ginsbergs and whatnot. And he sees that they interacted with Zen philosophy in a way. Aha! Well, they weren't reading the Japanese, so you could read what they were reading, the translations they'd have, and those would effectively become primary sources. Also, if you're writing about, say, the effects of Japanese Buddhism on the Beat generation, then Allen Ginsberg, in fact, is a primary source. So you'd look at what Ginsberg wrote about Zen Buddhism, you'd read what he read and see if you agree with how he interprets it, and then you would look at contemporary scholars of Beat poetry and see what they have to say. That's the critical argument, and then you contribute to the critical argument at the end. So when you're doing research, you have to think about how you're going to best cite. I use MLA citation. I use footnotes and parenthetical citations. every place is going to be different. So some places will use the Chicago Manual of Style. Some places will use APA, the American Psychological Association. You never really know. So you need to decide on that. And kind of at some point as you're writing along, if you're just writing for yourself, but if you're writing for a specific publication, say if you're writing for the Journal of the American Academy of Religions, you would use APA. Or if you're writing for Chicago, or if you're writing for History of Religions, Chicago Manual of Style. Or if you're writing for, actually, I think the Journal of the American Academy of Religion uses MLA. I don't know, doesn't matter. So you have to figure out your citation style according to the publications you have. One thing on primary and secondary sources that I wanted to mention is, do you have a sense of what happens or how scholarship is approached in the quote unquote University of Chicago model versus the Oxford model? What do those words mean anything to you? A little bit. What do those mean? How would you characterize?
Great institutions of learning.
I'll give you two quick examples. Think about my teacher, David Gordon White. He's trained by Wendy Doniger. He's considered one of the top people out of the University of Chicago and the University of Chicago School. Also think about, say, Hugh Urban. Going back further, Mircea Eliade, for that matter. The University of Chicago School looks to the phenomenology and history of religions. And they even call their method the history of religions model. So they're looking at themes, crossing religious traditions, crossing boundaries, going phenomenologically, but still historically, always looking at dates and times and categories. The Oxford School of Indology proper is philological. For them, the main work of scholarship is finding handwritten manuscripts and critically editing them, looking at all the different derivations, putting them together in a critical edition, and translating. That's it. They don't really say a lot on top of that. They'll make some vague arguments. This is why David will always say, he's like, you know, they do so much. It's just there's so much writing, but they don't really say anything. And I can hear his wife just saying, it's like an elephant giving birth to a mouse. So that Oxford school is very rigorous. And doing that philological work, the study of language changing and language interacting and text developing over time, is called philology. We don't really do that in the United States as much, though some of us do. I've been known to dabble in it. At Naropa, Ben does a wonderful combination of philology and history of religions. So when he and I sit down and really start arguing about Sanskrit, we'll be talking about manuscripts and different texts and whatnot, very nitty gritty. But then he and I both do the same thing, him from Harvard and me at UC Santa Barbara, that at the top of that, we want to say something. And Ben will always want to say something about what is a teacher? What is a guru? What is an autobiography? And I will want to be saying, what is magic? What is ritual? Those are the things that interest me. Whereas, you know, the philologist, if I was sitting down with my friend Peter Zanto, he would say, yeah, I don't care what magic is, but I got these 5 texts about it. I'm going to tell you what they say explicitly. And I reconstructed them out of 10 manuscripts each. It's a different method. You kind of need them both. And one way, the philologists do work that will last forever. In fact, people will always be looking at those critical editions because nobody wants to make another one. It's such a pain in the ass to do. But our work, I think, says more about the world and to the world, but our work is necessarily going to be dated. I mean, in 20 years from now, I will be known to be a cretin. This is why I look back at somebody like Mircea Eliade, and I appreciate what he did. I see him as being a cretin at some aspects. I don't hold it against him, you know? I don't hold it against scholars that, like, let's give it a very simple analogy now. We are very comfortable talking about non-binary people. Or we aren't, but we'll say we are. But you go back in time, like, can you be really mad in 1965 somebody was arguing there is male, there is female, and then they moved from there? Like, it wasn't an argument then. I think they were wrong then, but I don't really hold it against them. Then again, that's a slippery slope, because then what am I going to say? Do I hold against somebody for owning a slave? Yes, I do. Is it that it's their person at the time? Yes, they are, but I still hold it against them. So we have these sort of ways we think about the past, and we have to decide just how critical we need to be. But we need to always remember that we should be kind, because in the future, we will all be proven to be cretins. We're wrong about all sorts of stuff we don't know about yet. So be kind to the past, hold their feet to the fire, but don't worry, we will also be proved to be full of crap. That's just the nature of things. All right, so back to my little thingy. About halfway through it. Where's my... I'm just not doing great with technology today. That's me as a Catholic. And everything is good. Man, I tell you. Okay, I had that thing. These new monitors. Okay, so one thing you want to be careful to do is to never quote a quote. So always look to the primary quote if you can, if it is possible. So if you're reading in Paul Mueller-Ortega and he quotes Alexis Sanderson, go back and read the Alexis Sanderson. I was going through this constant battle with a student a little while back who wanted to talk about a specific theoretical idea called a polythetic model for religion. And he was summarizing using a contemporary thinker, Chris Wallace. Fine. But I was like, okay, so if you want to talk about polythetic definitions, well, this one you're pulling from this guy. This guy is pulling from Douglas Brooks. And Douglas Brooks, I think, and I argue, is in fact pulling from Agehananda Bharati. And Douglas Brooks is not just pulling from Agehananda Bharati, but he's using the idea of a polythetic model that he got out of J.Z. Smith, the big famous thinker in religious studies. So it's a polythetic model. Family resemblances. So I look at Tantra and I might say that guy might be Tantra, that guy might be Tantra. I can tell they're the same because they're initiated, they are cross-caste, they do rituals in this way. They might not have all the same things, but they have enough resemblances to call them the same thing and compare. So this student just wanted to stop. He's like, Chris Wallace said it. I'm like, no, you have to go back. You have to do the genealogy of everything. This is academic writing. So, if you have an idea about communism, you have to at least trace it back into somebody who summarizes Marx really well. So we always have to be looking at the influences on our ideas. So if I bring forth a theoretical model that I'm advancing, I have to demonstrate that I read the initial thinkers on that, the founding thinkers, and followed the conversation up to this point. So following the polythetic model, you can go, this is a really good way for me to understand this thing I'm looking at. Chris Wallace told me to, but the thing is, a lot of people would look and go, yeah, but what about? And then they might just go, I'm not reading that. If that guy didn't do the work to do the sort of genealogy of knowledge. Now, while this sounds exhausting, it becomes kind of thrilling. You get really excited writing these paragraphs where you're tracing, you suddenly like you're thinking about Derrida and then Foucault, and then suddenly you're thinking about the French Analysand school, and you're doing post-structuralism, but now you're doing structuralism, and you just spent 3 days and you know all this cool stuff now, and you see why Derrida is such a big deal. So my example of Chris Wallace summarizing something, but he's summarizing all these other things. You just need to follow all the chains back to the dawn of time, but you need to demonstrate to your reader that you have done the rigor and followed the evolutions of the arguments. When you are looking at your topic, I want you to think of 3 key things. And this is what Echo talks about: availability, accessibility, and understandability. So I'm looking at a topic. My topic is the mantra of the Gayatri. All right, first I have to look and see if it is available. So yeah, I can read a whole bunch of stuff about the Gayatri mantra. All right, now, can I read the stuff that's in Sanskrit? Yes, I can. I have those skills. Can I read the stuff that's in Hindi? Yes, I can. Can I read the stuff that's in Kannada? No, I cannot. All right, so I can get access to primary and secondary scholarship. I can go and read Finney and Garrity's stuff. It's all right there. Okay, so I'm capable of reading it. I am also able to get hold of it and then, so it exists, and I can get hold of it with relative ease. I can get an electronic copy. I can get a physical copy. So in order to do any research, you need to assess availability. Does a thing exist about this thing? Are there enough sources to even begin? And if there are, can I get access to them? And finally, can I read the languages? Or do I have, say, enough, like if I'm making an analytical philosophical argument and all I know is continental philosophy, then the analytical philosophy is not going to be understandable to me unless I take a long time to learn that. Or if everything's in Italian, I don't know Italian, that's a problem. So as you're approaching everything, think about availability, accessibility, and understandability. Okay. One interesting argument that Eco makes at the beginning of his book, that I think we read earlier, is he says, look, you've got to write a thesis to finish your capstone degree. Well, you got a year to write one. And he says, you got to figure out how to do that as efficiently as possible. But he also says, why are you writing this? Are you writing it just so you can get out of college and get a job? And then he says, I will tell you, and this is not ethical, but you should just go steal it. You should pay someone to write it for you. If it's only about getting the credentials, you're like, it's totally unethical, but if that's all it is, that's all it is. So what are y'all doing? You're writing something that is about a credential, but it's also about a capstone and a fulfillment of a project you've been working on for some time. So you need to be faithful to yourself and honest with yourself and give yourself enough time in these 3 months to get this darn thing written. And you will get it written, but you need to give yourself the energy to do it with enough rigor that you yourself are satisfied. You'll be able to convince me that I'll be satisfied, but you need to have you be satisfied on this, because this is really the first substantial piece of scholarship you've ever written. And the cool thing about this is you're going to submit these, and these are going to go into the worldwide database of master's theses. These could be read for hundreds of years. If somebody comes across some very specific argument that you made and they want to explore it, they might go back. You are contributing to the sum total of human knowledge. So how much research do you need to do? You need to have complete enough of a bibliography to demonstrate that you know the subfield. So sometimes in the bibliography, you're less showing what you're reading, as I was saying this before, and showing that you know all the stuff you need to read. But what do you need to read in the bibliography? I mean, this is another problem I find with undergraduates. They say, I've got 8 books on this topic. I got to read all of these before I start writing. Nope. You need to read just enough to start making the argument and then start writing and then read and write as you go. And you'll change your argument if you need to. But the key is to start before you are ready, because you're never really ready. Finally, when looking at quotes, which I think is a good part of it. Yeah, when looking at quotes, always find the most original quote as possible. If possible, quote it in the original language. I mean, sometimes, let's say you're reading right along. Let's say you're reading, as like I said before. Let's say you're reading Chris Wallace. Again, I'll use Brother Chris. You're reading Chris, and he's got a translation, or he's got a quote of a translation by Alexis Sanderson. So do not quote a quote. Don't quote that and say it's Chris Wallace, because it's not. He's quoting Sanderson. So you have to go back to Sanderson. Ideally, we can't always do this. Go back to Sanderson and make sure that Chris wrote it down right. He might have got it down wrong. And then if he got it down wrong, then you got it down wrong. One trick around this is you can write quoted in. So that's a little bit of a way around it. But whenever possible, you should go back and find the earliest version of a quote. What's really galling is when you find somebody that'll be, let's say, using Sanderson again, they'll say, Abhinava argues in Tantra Loka X, and they'll cite Sanderson. And then you go back to the Sanderson quote, and it's him making an overall critical argument that is not exactly what Abhinava says, but it's his interpretation. So then by following the quote back, you see that the quote is actually incorrect or incorrectly interpreted. And you don't want to be accused of that. It stinks. All right. It's 11 o'clock. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to jump up and down. And then we're going to come back and talk about annotated bibliographies. And we'll have a kind of a short class today, so y'all can write. Sound good? All right. You got 5 minutes. Okay. We are back. All right, so tell me about your annotated bibliographies. What did you your assignment was to either do one new one or two old ones. So how do you approach it? What do you end up doing? And if possible, I'd like you to share a couple of sentences from the annotated bib that you wrote, but also like let me know how long it was. If you had any questions about how to do these, like my buddy William Chavez always says that writing annotated bibliographies, he's so weird. He's like, are like one of his favorite things in the world. You'll meet him. He has an incredible brain. All right. Reactions, thoughts, questions, comments, and feel free to share a sentence or two, but also just tell us what you read.
Okay, well, I did my primary sources, so I thought that would be a great place to start.
Oh.
So I did the Samkhya Karka and the Samkhya Saptati Vritti. Obviously I used Gerald Larson, his translation from his classical Samkhya.
Yeah.
And in there, I just kind of put the concept of what and who is a part of the world of Prakriti will be the focal point of my thesis. So, within these concepts of like I was speaking to last week, these realms that I was looking at with the divine, celestial, yeah. The Samkhya Karka will be the primary source of the paper to examine the Karka 53, which defines the world of Prakriti as containing three realms, divine, human, and animal. An examination of where the verse is explained in the text, like within the whole text, is explained in the text, and its relationship to the following verses indicates that these realms define where Purusha suffers. So that's kind of what I kind of felt a little more like I was doing the generative writing and letting that kind of.
That's good. That's what I want to happen. Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. If you're writing your annotated bibliography, and you can consider the annotated bibliography to be generative writing, your prompt is the book.
Cool.
But
Yeah.
I mean, if stuff comes out, right. But in an annotated bibliography, what you need to have is the full bibliographic citation and whatever form you're going to use, and then sort of an explanation of who is the author, what is the context, and then what are like the main interventions, what are the main arguments the author makes, and summaries of data, but only if that data is really specific to your argument. Like here with these texts. What I think with you, Allison, is you need to do for Larson, you need to have not only the annotated bibliography for the primary text, but you also need to have bibliographic entries for Larson himself and his arguments. So classical Samkhya as a book itself. And you actually might even want to split up your annotated bibliography in half into primary and secondary sources. So your secondary sources would be Larson's arguments, and then your primary sources could be right there, and I would just list the source, and then under it, I would say, under the list of the source, I would say Larson and give him, again, give the bibliographic stuff, all the Larson stuff. But then if you find another version of the text or another translation, put another one under it. So you're keeping an organization of your primary text and other versions of the primary text, or adding new primary texts. You'll even look at a lot of academic books and you'll see that they have their bibliographies are divided into primary and secondary sources. Not
They
all,
do.
many do.
No, but I love when they do. It makes it so much easier.
It also makes them easier to write.
It does, yeah. So I had two paragraphs for the annotated bibliography. The first one was describing the text and trying to bring it a little bit more about what I'll be talking about, kind of focusing around. And then the other one I did was the copy that I'm working with for the Samkhya Saptati Vritti. It's Esther Solomon's translation of, or her edition of it.
Who is she?
She was primarily around Gerald Larson's time in the 70s, and she did a lot of work on Sankhya. She went through a lot of the commentaries and cleaned
She's got books, she's got articles.
I have to look for articles. Yeah, I have a book about the commentaries where she's trying to trace which commentaries were first and like things
So
in order.
she wrote a book on the commentarial traditions on the Sankhya-Karikas. Gotcha.
Did, and she worked on the commentaries, like making them, like
Yeah.
cleaning up the Sanskrit text and making them, I can't think of the word. What is the word?
Editing,
Books.
checking the
Very-
attested emendations.
Yeah, that. She
Yeah,
did that.
emendation. That's the
Um, it's kind of funny because Larson doesn't think too highly of her work. So I was like, oh, snap. All right.
That's
Um,
interesting. I wonder, do you know who she did? And this is part of the drama of the whole thing. So
there
where
is,
did she do her PhD?
I'm sorry.
Where did she do her PhD?
I don't know. That's an excellent
Did
question.
she do a PhD?
I think so. But I'll look.
All right. Well, then where? Who'd she study with?
That's a great question.
Yeah, maybe it's somebody that Larson hated in the first place. There's
Ooh,
always drama in this.
like a soap opera.
So, I mean, the great dramatic thing is the grand war between Alexis Sanderson and Mark Dyczkowski, which we all still suffer under. But there's always elements of this, like, you know, the strained relationship between Jim Mallinson and David White. These are interesting things, and it's worth knowing the conversations around them, not just for academic gossip, but it makes it juicy. One of my favorite books is a book by Morton Singer, or is it Morton Smith, called Jesus Christ Magician. And it's a fascinating book that argues that Jesus Christ learned magic in Egypt, and that was the source of all of his abilities later, and a secret gospel that this one scholar discovered. And then there are arguments for like 20 years of people taking this book apart and saying that the author dreamed up the and wrote the discovered text itself, and that he was fabricating sources, and other people like, no, he actually got it right. So it's like the story of it gets exciting. Now, if you're a weirdo like me, these are my favorite stories. I love a literary story. And let's not forget, who is Umberto Eco, who we read today? He wrote In the Name of the Rose, which is a book about a monastic community in Italy where there are banned naughty books, and scholars who go and read them secretly end up dying. And how are they dying? Because there's poison in the ink, and they lick their thumbs, like that thumb that just came up, turn
What?
the page, and they lick their thumb to turn the page, and they get the poison in their mouth, and it kills them. There's a movie about it. It has Sean Connery, Christian Slater, and a very young Ron Perlman, In the Name of the Rose. So anyway,
Okay.
these types of literary novels give you a sense of the scope and the ridiculousness of this. And remembering everybody knows each other. So Larson, knowing Jerry, he probably knew this woman, probably hung around with her. They probably had drinks together. And if you met Larson, he was huge. I mean, to me, he looked like he was 6'4". He was like a mountain of a man. And he was jovial and very sweet and congenial, but a tough guy when it came, like very rigorous. When he taught Sanskrit, and I tried to do this in my Sanskrit class at Naropa, it didn't work. He just, day one, you're reading Devanagari. Boom, day one. He's going around the room and you're reading and you're working with him and you're translating. You're learning the script and you're reading from day one. Naropa students didn't care for that. It was a fun experiment. It didn't work out. But at the end of Sanskrit 1, every single one of them could read Devanagari very well. So that did work out. Anyway, the academic pageantry of it is useful. And if you'd like to follow that a little bit further into the very specifics of our field, you can look at the writings of Lee Siegel, who wrote an academic novel called Love in a Dead Language, which is wonderful. It was written in the late 90s, and he pretty much skewers white male Sanskrit academics in a way that is just so poignantly beautiful. And he sets it in a fictional university, Santa Agora, like Santa Barbara. And in the end, one of the main characters is killed when he's bludgeoned to death with the Monier-Williams dictionary. It's kind of great.
Awesome.
And there's also a lecherous professor that finagles a young Indian girl to go to India with him and then like cancels on everybody else. So it's just her and him on this study abroad, and it's as sketchy as it sounds. But he really like gets into like just the it's almost like reading Nabokov's Lolita, but not quite as creepy. But it does a lot of work. Lee Siegel is a famous Sanskritist. He wrote the book Laughing Matters, which is the best book I've ever read, probably the only book I've ever really written on humor in Sanskrit drama and Sanskrit poetry. It's wonderful. Okay, so why am I bringing all this up? These people are real people.
Right.
So when you see that somebody, when like you're reading critical reviews and book reviews, there's often something deeper in there. So this is where you go to Ben and you go, so they know each other, and then you find that it brings it all to life in a fun way. I mean, I know Paul Eduardo Muller Ortega. I like him quite a bit. He got his book Tragic Heart of Shiva, I think, is wonderful. There's plenty I don't agree with it, but it's a very good book. It got a negative review by Alexis Anderson. He never really published again, and I've always wondered if that was there's some. So finding the human story is one of the things that will help your research come along. So to think, and because you can think, like when I sit down to write, I think about Theon Hadrian and Gudrun Boneman and Georg Torzig, who had written the only stuff that's been written on the material I work on. And that helps me think about it in a human way. You know, Stephen Jay Gould wrote a wonderful book called A Wonderful Life about big shifts in evolutionary science thinking. And he says, trust me, I'm getting somewhere in this. And he says, it's hard to write about Dr. this and this professor at this place when it's really just me thinking about Mark and George and Andy. And he tried to write in a way that you could hear Mark and George and Andy in these like towering, but very odd figures, because that's how academics are. They're towering and odd. So whenever possible, find the human drama behind what you're writing about. And you would be surprised at how it somehow, it brings a life to your writing that you wouldn't expect. You're next, Brooke. I'm giving you the sneer.
All right. So for mine, I did a new article.
Great.
Mindfulness in Practice, the lineage of mindfulness.
All right. Who wrote it?
Written by two folks. So it was a tag team, Edwo Shonin, and William Van Gordon.
Okay, so I know neither of these people, and I didn't ask these questions to Allison because I knew what she was talking about. So right off the bat, and I want to hear so much more, but what I want to know is, where was it published? What's kind of the genre of it? And how, the other questions will come later. Yeah, so where was it published and what is the genre of the text? And it's interesting that it's two people because that suggests it's more social sciencey.
Yeah. Hold on, let me get
Good. Someone else struggling to find something on a screen. It's not just me.
Yeah, I'm always embarrassing about that type of stuff. 1 second, please. So it was written in a book, The Power of Books to Redefine Yoga.
Wow. Who published that?
Publish articles in this is where, hold on, sorry. It should be right
It's
there.
all right, Brooke, but what you need to do is at the top of your annotated bibliography, you should have the full title, the book it's from, and the publisher. The reason I'm asking this is because that publisher information tells you a lot. It doesn't tell you a lot. It tells me a lot.
Yeah. sorry, admittedly. So, it was published by Springer.
Okay, Springer's an academic press, but they are more social sciencey. Again, okay, so it's a Springer Press book, and it's a book about powerful books about yoga. So it's in a yoga text. So that's interesting in and of itself. That it's you said it was mindfulness article?
Yeah, it's mindfulness and practice, the lineage of mindfulness. And so
I already have a ton of questions. That sounds like a good source, but it's one I think you'll have to be careful. You might need to read it critically. All right, so tell me about it.
Okay. So I thought it was interesting because it essentially it kind of demystifies and pokes holes at this idea of authenticity in mindfulness. And so he goes to talk about how in mindfulness it's very authenticity and spiritual potency and effectiveness gets used a lot. And
that in and of itself is an interesting question. Potency versus authenticity.
Yeah,
Circle that. That's an idea.
I do have that written. Yeah.
Of course you do. You're very smart.
So he talks about he talks about this fascination with authenticity, and he's a former monk. So like people when he was before he got into academia, he would say, you know, he'd be in his robes and stuff, and people would like come to him and bow and like ask him all these.
Was he a Buddhist monk? Was he a Buddhist monk?
Yes, Buddhist monk.
You know, was Tibetan or Zen or Theravada?
He is in the Tibetan tradition.
That tells me a whole bunch. So again, we're finding the human drama, and you should always Google your authors and figure out where they're coming from in their history. We're already learning a lot here. Okay, so he's coming from that Tibetan Buddhist perspective.
Okay. Yeah, I see you. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Tibetan Buddhist teachers. And so he talks about this experience of how like people would like come to him and bow and ask all these questions, like what's your lineage, who's your teacher? Yeah. And, you know, and then they essentially they thought he had like these mystical powers to somehow make their meditation or their experience with mindfulness more potent. And he goes in to demystify this idea of potency from Eastern folks from Asia, essentially. And I thought it was really interesting because he goes further to say that what makes a lineage, that lineage essentially doesn't matter. Like in the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism specifically, it's just the word lineage is just a passage of teachers, like who taught whom. And that doesn't make it more effective or more authentic. It's just
I
literally
can't imagine a single Tibetan ever saying that, which is fascinating.
Yeah. So that's where I had, and I thought that was really interesting and powerful because he goes on to say that Dharma holders, it's the realization itself of the truth of emptiness, that inner realization that truly counts. That is the transmission. So and then he goes on to say you can be self-realized, like your own path and by yourself, and you can come to enlightenment. So yeah, so he pretty much just tears up this idea that they're Dharma holders and that lineage makes anything better or more potent. And he talks about the intention and the authenticity of the actual practitioner that makes it real or authentic, not the teacher, not the institution. Which I thought that was really interesting. especially for practitioners in the West, because I've been playing with that too, with my own personal lineage, who I consider, anyway. So I thought that was really interesting. Couple of things that I would like for you to listen to. Okay, so this is me breaking down language a bit and defining
And again,
things.
right, exactly. You're writing your annotated bibliography, you're summarizing, you're like, I got an idea. Boom, you get that down. It might not come back, probably will, but it might not.
Okay, so lineage is basically about being able to trace transmissions, ancestry of particular meditations, traditions, or meditation teachers. That's a sentence I wrote defining something. And I was wondering, you tell me if they're clear. And then the second one, it was more of a question, and I was wondering if like that's cool too in your annotated bibliography. So I said language.
100% research questions. Those are better than observations, because a research question is going to get you further. An observation might make you go, oh, I fixed that, or seduce you to thinking you figured something out.
So I said, so language is important when defining religion.
Yeah.
What's being implied when we use words such as authenticity, spiritual potency, and effectiveness? And then those are my two things that like.
You got a lot going on there.
I always have a lot going on. I know.
That's fantastic. Better too much than not enough. All right, so where to start? Okay, the first thing is this guy's an ex-Buddhist monk, and he's an ex-Buddhist Tibetan monk. Buddhists consider lineage to be a huge deal, and he's saying, no, it's not. So he's making a break from his own tradition there. Now, lineage in Sanskrit is parampara, this, then that, this, then that. It's the chain. And then in the West, when you think about lineage, I think about Catholicism and apostolic succession. The idea is you shake the hand of the Pope, who shook the hand of the last Pope, and the last Pope, to the guy who shook the hand of the first Pope, Peter, among the apostles. So these are ideas of lineage. Authenticity is an abyss that I don't find has ever been satisfactorily answered in any realm, but it's something we're constantly thinking about. And as I've said so many times already in this class, when something's said to be Asian, it's automatically authentic. And that's why people like us come in and go, oh, don't you do that. Because it might not actually be from the East in the first place. And even if it is, you might not have it right. So the thing that jumps at me is something that, because you're not a scholar of Buddhism, you're not going to readily see. Now, within Buddhism in the 19th and 20th century, there became a thing called Buddhist modernism. This really came out of thinkers like D.T. Suzuki and in the contemporary world, Thich Nhat Hanh. Like a lot of these Buddhist thinkers were trying to create a version of Buddhism that had no superstition, that was against notions of lineages, that you could do on your own, that was not heavily ritual, and was considered modern. Notice it would also be similar to Protestant Christianity, because it's no rituals. You know, you can do it on your own. Just read the scripture yourself in English, and it's fine. So a lot of this is also called, critically, Protestant Buddhism. So this guy is making a common move in the 20th century and the 21st century, which is to say, I came from being within the tradition with all of its Tibetan Catholicity, with its saints and its magic powers and its whatnot. And honestly, when you're on the ground in Buddhist communities, the saints, the magic powers, the lineages, that's the big part. I mean, what do you do with Buddhism, a tradition that says you have to meditate to be enlightened, and then only 5% of Buddhists actually meditate? And even among monks, it's only about like 15 or 20%. That's conservative. People don't meditate. And in fact, especially like, you know, a lot of people I know who have lived in Tibetan monasteries, they're shocked by this. They're shocked that they get in there and 90% of the monks are just worker monks. They just run the monastery and keep things going. But it's an institution. It's a religion. You need that. So this guy you're talking about is actually positing an ideal of Buddhism. And in fact, that ideal of Buddhism was really well set out in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Thailand, when the Theravada Reformation happened, and these forest monks came into the city and were just trying to like clean up everything and create a very modern, non-superstitious, meditation-oriented, less lineage, all of that, posited this idea of a reformed Theravada, a reformed old school Buddhism that goes right back to the words of the Buddha. Does that sound at all like going right back to the early Christian church? Or every goofy old uncle around me growing up saying, well, we're not like the Catholics. We go back to the early Christian church. We're like what Jesus did with the apostles and whatnot. I'm like, yeah, so you're baptizing the dead and having feasts in the middle of the night in graveyards? No? Well, then you're not back to the early church. That's a whole other ballgame. So you're dealing with a lot of cool stuff in there, Brooke, and there's a lot of background. So what I like is you're taking that and finding arguments against authenticity and against potency and whatnot. And I want you to keep using those, but I want you to be aware that this guy's grinding an axe. So that's where you got to Google the guy, figure out who he is and who that other person is. And then also look, and what if you find that this person's like a chaplain at a university? Well, that's interesting. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that can come out of figuring out where that perspective is. But I want you to be aware of this notion of Buddhist modernism, because it's also really similar to the way people are like, yoga is just about health. It's not about the superstitions, all that. It's not about gods. It's not about India. It's just about health. And then also you have this great, you're making the same point that you didn't elucidate, and that's fine, but how you're questioning your own lineage. That's a big movement, as you all know, within the yoga world and yoga discourse. There's that book, Post-Lineage Yoga. For me, the minute it gets post-lineage, it stops being interesting to me because it stops being about India at all. And I kind of, you know, as much as I don't agree with, no, there's no way to agree with it. I like the yoga gurus of the 20th century. I think they're sketchy as all hell, but I find them fascinating, you know? I mean, would I want to sit down and have dinner with Bikram? No, thank you. Would I want to read about his wackiness? Yes, please. Because I'm a religious studies scholar. This is history of religions. I'm not interested in what the authentic yoga is, and I don't think there's anything that is authentic yoga. If I could find an authentic yoga that was like what people were doing once upon a time, I'd be dealing with a hatha yogi in India. But even they are changing so fast, it doesn't look like what's in the text. If you look at the philological work of Mallinson and Birch, you can get close to seeing what people were actually doing as reconstructed from the text. And Jason Birch's wife, Jacqueline Hargraves, has been looking at the Sanskrit texts and then working with practitioners to try to reproduce what these texts are describing. Of course, the problem is maybe the texts are prescribing something that never happened in the first place. Religious studies. So yes, you come into Europa to learn the truth of yoga, and at the end, you get Dr. Ulrich who says, there is no truth, there is no yoga, have a great life. So this is how we're going to progress. Now, you, of course, don't have to agree with me, but I'm going to continue to complicate things as I go. Because that's how my teachers always taught me. I just make an argument. I'll make it more complicated. I think I figured it out by making it more complicated. Oh, it could get more complicated. I mean, David would send me down, so you know, I'm reading like 17th century French books. What the hell is he? Why does he want me to find out of this? So that'll happen. But what we're going to be doing is for next week, I want you to have, did I say 5 or 6? I can't remember what I said. So expand. You got 2, you got 1 already. So do this again, but pay attention to what you're doing. So like the people, the publishers, the years it was written, other stuff, who are they making references to? look at their bibliographies and see who they are reading to make their arguments. And I mean, with this Tibetan Buddhist guy, I would love to know if he was a Gelug or a Kagyu, but I have a history with Tibetan stuff. So, you know, it's not
Who's
just
a Kagyu?
the Gelugpas are the dominant ones of the Dalai Lama. The Kagyus are more associated with balloons, evidently. Sort of open meditation and Dzogchen. They were somewhat connected to the state. The Shakyas were the great artists, and they've died out for the most part, but historically they were aligned with other governments and were able to propagate Buddhism through the arts. And finally, the Nyingma are the old school group, the earliest version that are more into Dzogchen meditation and magic, for lack of a better term. So my guess is this guy was a Gelug, which the Dalai Lama's lineage. Could have been a Kagyu, especially if you practice in the United States. So these also tell us more about the people. We need to keep the people involved there. But as you're writing, context, major argument, think of it as this way. What's their intervention? What's the intervention they are making? That's their major intervention. And then list data that might be useful. And then after that, or as you're doing that, like I said, I write note in capital letters. And then I know it's just me. I'm not summarizing. Whatever you riff on, whatever ideas you get as you're going that aren't exactly out of the book, or if you disagree with something, say, and I disagree with because of this and this and this, keep track of those. Those ideas will come up again and be incredibly useful to you over time. All right, so we are at the end of class. I have a favor to ask y'all in a minute, but first I want to do a quick check-in. And what are you looking forward to in the next week? And what are you scared of in the next week? You're in a safe space, I swear, because I'll beat up anybody that makes it otherwise.
I guess for me, one thing, can I ask you? I know I don't want to take up everyone's time, but I do have a question after this statement. But I can ask at the very end. But as far as looking forward to, I've really been enjoying the research. So
Fun.
I'm looking forward to continuing that. And the thing I wouldn't say least or like not looking to, but the writing portion of it. I enjoy writing, but then I get, self-conscious about hitting the mark, if that makes sense. Even though I know there is
no, more. What do you mean by hitting the mark?
Coming across clear, concise, writing a paper that comes across as learned to my peers.
Okay. Well, there's some quick strategies on that. One, you got to write to write. So you got to do the writing. And I want to observe to you that I alternate between writing and feeling really good and writing and feeling horrible and not writing and feeling really horrible. But generally, when I go from not writing to writing and feeling horrible, if I stick with it, the joy comes back, but only if I put in that effort. And there's a thing I've been thinking about with my ADHD that I was reading about, and it talks about a default mode network. That's just your brain not doing a task. And if you have ADHD, most people have their brain not doing a task, then they shift into doing a task, they're really focused, and they're like, oh, I'm tired of this task. Let me get back into my place. Oh, all right, I feel better. Boom, back into the task. With ADHD, you get stuck in that default mode network. And it's just like, that's what makes me watch TV endlessly. That's what makes me just ruminate and not be able to let go of stuff. That's what keeps me putting off writing, is being in that state where it's just my brain doing its thing and not oriented toward a task. But if I jump up and down, if I count the amount of squares in a room, if I pick up a book that's not fiction, if I just do something that's a task, if I go do the dishes, after that, my task-oriented brain is working, and then I can go and write. when I'm just stuck in the ruminating, not getting anywhere, I won't get to the task. But if I do another task, then I activate the task thing and go. So that's something I'm thinking about a lot lately. But for you, what I really want to hear and own, Brooke, is that fear of not hitting the mark, but also to have some faith that the more you don't hit the mark, the closer you're going to get to hitting the mark consistently. It's just like I knew a guy who was a Navy SEAL, and he said, and his later in his life, he wanted to learn archery. And he went and he approached it just like everything else he'd learned, even though it was a little different muscularly and whatnot. And he just went out and shot arrows all the time. And it's just, and he got good at it, but it took a long time. It didn't come easy to him. But he realized it's just he had to go out and shoot arrows. So he would go out and shoot arrows 100 times a day. And in time, he got better at it. And that's how writing is. So, you know, show up. That's the key. All right, Allison, then we'll get back to Brooke's final question.
The thing that I'm scared of is actually getting to the 40 pages. Like that seems very right now. I'm just like, how the hell am I gonna get 40 pages?
You don't,
Like,
okay. Own that, it's not gonna be a problem.
that's
Because
what I keep saying.
because you're going to have 6 pages, and then our next peer editing, I'm going to ask another 6 pages, and the next thing you know, you're going to have 30 pages, and you're going to have 4 new ideas. Everybody writes over, so that won't be a problem. But I want to own that fear. You know, it's like even when I start writing on something, it'll be like, how am I ever going to get to 5,000 words? But I know me, and to write 5,000 good words, I have to write 15,000 words. And then
Right.
it just adds up.
Yes.
What are you looking forward to? What are you excited about?
I'm really enjoying working with the texts and learning how to do these translations and seeing what comes out of it. Kind of feels like I'm reading a mystery novel right now. And each time I meet with Ben, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what it says. I'm like, that's so cool. And so like I'm really excited. I like the next paragraph I need to write for my thesis is incorporating some of the translations he and I did last week. And that's really cool to me. Like I can't believe I actually get to do that. Like put that in a paper. And so that I'm super excited about.
I remember when I was first working on my dissertation, I started translating whole texts.
Yeah.
And I sometimes, and I remember hearing at an academic bar one time, a guy who's a chemist talking about getting to a certain point in his research where he couldn't sleep at night. And I was getting to the point sometimes like, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen in the next folio? I don't know. And I was just generating and it's thrilling. So get into it. And there are academic books. There are novels about this. You ever hear of a book called The Historian?
Yes, I love that book.
There you go. That's an academic
book.
history. That's what you're doing right now.
I love that book.
Okay.
It's so much
Tell
fun.
Brooke what The Historian is, assuming you haven't read it. Maybe you've read it. I don't know.
It's been a really long time. The Historian, which one is that? I know it's Elizabeth Kostova. And is that that's not the one about Dracula? Which one is it?
It is the one about Dracula.
It is the one about Dracula. Oh my God, Brooke, you got to read this one. It's so good. She traces the history of Dracula and ends up meeting him, and it's really cool and it's scary.
Yeah, it shifts from her being in libraries to her
Yes.
actually finding the stuff she researches is real. It's great. It's kind of a fantasy for all academics. All right, I'm going to ask my favor, and then I want your question. Here is my favor. I'm at the end of a chapter I've been working on for a thing on embodiment and pedagogy that I've told you about. I have the draft out to 2 other scholars, and I haven't gotten feedback from them yet. I need feedback. How would y'all feel about reading a draft of something I have in print? So it's 6,000 words, and what I would ask you is, does it make sense? What data could be useful or not? And in particular, the structure of the argument and the paragraphs. Now, I have 2 reasons for this. 1, I need comments. And 2, you can see somebody in process when they write. So what I do in my writing process, as I've told you, is I write a bare outline, and then I fill out the outline and expand it. And then once it's big enough and rich enough, then I turn every outline entry into full paragraphs. And then and that's where it's at right now, full paragraphs in an outline. And then the last step, and I need feedback before I can do the last step, is I take that outline in full paragraphs and I turn it into the proper draft. So it won't be extra credit or anything, but yeah.
Well, I'd be
Okay.
happy to.
I'll
It sounds
distribute
very
it,
helpful.
and for those of y'all that are listening, and you can give me written feedback, you can do however you like. It will all be very useful to me. And then eventually I'll send it out and I'll get feedback back from the editors, and I'd like to share those with you, and I'll tell you when it finally does get printed. So you can follow the process of this thing going into print.
I would be
never had a
honored.
professor do that for me, and I think it would have been really helpful.
That sounds cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Brooke, what was your one last question?
Okay. So reading the article with the Tibetan book, ex-Tibetan monk, it got me thinking, and I just kind of wanted to hear you all's perspective about this idea of just like openness and the expansion of mindfulness, and the fact, like I've heard arguments that, you know, it grows and it's alive and all these other things, which I do feel is true. But I wonder if it's also not, if it's also an excuse maybe to lean on intellectual laziness a bit, because, and I say this because for myself as a practitioner, I think one of the things that has drawn me to yoga and has just drawn me to these practices is reading about the actual lineages, and reading about the practice, and really kind of taking ownership in some of the deep and beautiful philosophical questions and natures of the actual practice. I feel like it's just fed me in my life so much that, yeah, I'm just not sure I really believe that argument. Like, I think a part of me just feels like it's an argument to give credence for people to whitewash or, you know, use these technologies for whatever agendas they have. And I think that's a way that's like very unfair. And I feel like, you know, I think it has a lot of implications about like race and parts of the world and all of that stuff. Cause it's like, you don't see that with Catholicism, right? Or other Western religions that we're taught to like hold reference for, and like, you know, hold and really, yeah, hold and respect. So I'm gonna move on from that, but that was kind of like my question. Or I just kind of want to comment around that.
You have thoughts,
If
Allison?
you have any.
Brooke, I really appreciate how you said that there is these concepts of mindfulness, but that you really appreciate reading the actual practices and the histories of it. So I feel like there is this, at least going through Naropa, we have this very real sense of there's this practice of what people do today, of what we just commonly call modern postural yoga or mindfulness practices, yoga for health, whatever we want to think about it. And then there are the actual historical components that can trickle in. And I have a really I'm one of those very curmudgeonly people about the modern postural yoga, where I really do think it is whitewashed. I think it is very heavily influenced by racial concerns and conversations. And, you know, I get very concerned when I hear the conversation speaking to just, well, it's really good for you. It's mindful. It's, you know, going to make you feel relaxed, and it helps you take care of yourself. And I get a little hesitant about those types of yoga practices. Right. And so I don't know. I think for me, I always tread carefully in those conversations. To me, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? And I look forward to hearing the end result of your project, because I think it'll help us have a better understanding of what authentic practice could be when you look a little deeper and dig a little deeper, and what these modern ideas are. So I'm really excited to see what you come up with.
Oh, thank you.
So this is not a standard white guy devil's advocate argument. I hate those guys. I hate those arguments. But it's a religious studies argument. How is white lady woo woo Lululemon minivan a big stupid cup from Saturday Night Live last week? How is that not authentic? I mean, I think it is perfectly authentic white lady nonsense, but it's white lady nonsense nonetheless. My dilemma with it is I practice, and y'all practice, a hermeneutics of suspicion. So you go, in spite of it being its own thing, it does have elements of, if not cultural appropriation, which is a phrase that doesn't seem to mean anything anymore. I need to get into what it actually means. It has a sense of claiming authenticity from a place that they have no business claiming. However, people do that. It's religion. I mean, people have always done this in religion. I mean, how is the white lady woo-woo nonsense different from the first hatha yogis who took mental yoga and started doing it solely with their bodies? And this is an argument that a lot of yoga studies scholars are making now. It's a more sophisticated argument that yoga has always been an evolving tradition that would change according to influences and take up new aspects and be done in different ways. This is just yet another thing yoga is doing. However, I also like the argument that there are all these different yogas. They're not the same. Patanjali yoga is not hatha yoga. And hatha yoga, as it's practiced in the 1500s, is not what's going on with Swami Vivekananda, which is not what's going on with, what's going on in yoga journal. I mean, I think it's important to see that those things might be homonyms. They have the same names, but they're not the same things. But the important thing is, and this is the critical theorist in me, is to always practice hermeneutics of suspicion, to not take anything at face value, to look at the genealogy of ideas, but also, and this is my key point to the both of you and everyone else out there, don't let it eat your head. Don't let the critical suspicion just make your head just go, because you'll want to. That's when you have to take a step back and realize this is religion, this is culture, these things change. And I'm not saying we should be objective, but I'm saying we do need to not get too caught up in calling authenticity and inauthenticity. We need to call a spade, which is a great statement to make because it's about shovels and not racist terminology, despite 3 gnarly arguments I had with a friend of mine. She's like, nope, that's a racist one. I'm like, I don't think it is. And then I really looked and it's about a shovel. But what's the point? The point is always practice a hermeneutics of suspicion. Be careful about what ideas you use. And remember that every idea traces back to other ideas. And by being intellectuals, by being academics, and just being informed human beings, we need to just never trust shit. We gotta be careful. And I love that Brooke is digging into this mindfulness thing because I'm getting that. She's starting to scratch some itches I have. And I don't particularly care that she's reminding me of a few of my itches. And some of them I've been pretty mad about a long time. Don't even get me started about white dudes studying Buddhism and pretending to be, okay, I guess they are authentically Buddhist. Or vegetarian Buddhists. Yeah, so that is class for the day. I'll see you next week. I am going to need to start getting our speakers times set up, which I've been dragging my feet on because we changed the time and that just got everything in the muck. So next week we will have there's a thing on the webpage about it. Just be ready to write. We're going to do a lot of writing. You're going to be reading a section from Robert Boyce's book. It's not long, but it has a couple of different writing exercises, and I recommend you try some of them in advance. They're like 10 minutes each. And I'll probably pull something else out of Helen's Sword for us to just kind of support it. But be ready to come to class and write. But the majority of things I want you to do is work on your annotated bibliographies. Yes. Allison, you can.
I'm batting my dog.
Oh, well, Abhaya Mudra, have no fear. All right, y'all, it's been a great class. This always charges my batteries. I'm off to a seminar where we're reading somebody's paper that's in the works in a large group. The postdoctoral fellows. Writing communities are powerful things to have. So I'm going to be reading about environmental justice tradition and John Muir, who was one of the founders of the Sierra Club and whatnot. And he also used quite a bit of unpleasant racist language. So on environmentalism after George Floyd. I'm looking forward to this piece. Okay, I will send out my thing to y'all and thank you for all your help. I hope you have a wonderful week. Don't get scared, be brave, do good, fight evil.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks, bye.